I genuinely believe that people wake up in the morning and think, oh, Saajid might be filming a video today, so that means it's a good day to do construction. Anyways, let's see if I could actually finish filming this video whilst maintaining my sanity. So back in 2017, 2018, there was one book taking the entire book community by storm, and that was The Seven Husbands of Evelyn Hugo by Taylor Jenkins Reid. At this point in time, however, I had a disposition of not being like other girls, you know? I was quirky, I was #different.
I'm like quirky.
I wasn't going to be reading what everybody else was reading. I was reading the underdogs, okay? I was reading niche works of literature. An example of what I was reading, you might ask? Well, Hannah Montana Swept Up by Susan Harper. A divine and riveting novelization of one of the most impactful TV shows of our generation, I might add. But another reason why I stayed away from this book is, although I did find it somewhat interesting and I knew that I would read it eventually, I found that the story didn't appeal to me, at least the story that I was being pitched. Whenever people talked about this book, whenever people mentioned it, what they would say about it is that it's a story about this old Hollywood starlet named Evelyn Hugo, infamous for being married 7 times, who's being interviewed by a young up-and-coming journalist about the secrets of her life. And I was like, okay, that sounds intriguing, but I don't really get what's so appealing about this book. But upon having actually read this book 3 years after the hype train, I'm starting to realize that that is partially what the story is about, but that is definitely not the main focus. I would say that that is how the story is told, but that's definitely not what it's truly centered around. Y'all lied to me.
Guys, it was all a lie. She lied.
Okay, y'all didn't lie to me, but like, y'all didn't really give me a good sense of what this book was when you were reviewing it back in 2017, 2018. So what is this story actually about, you might ask? Well, this is the story of Evelyn Hugo, a famous Hollywood starlet who rose to fame in the 1950s and was known for being married 7 times, and whose truest love was never actually any of those 7 husbands, but rather a woman by the name of Celia St. James, who was also another Hollywood actress.
Let's go, lesbians, let's go!
This book is ultimately and first and foremost the love story of Evelyn and Celia. And the central conflict of this story was how their status as public figures put a strain on their relationship. It's a story about being queer as a celebrity during a time where being queer was not widely accepted. And it focused on how Evelyn had to build her life around this struggle. It's also a story about tragedy, fame, family, and how all of those things were inextricably linked for Evelyn. And all of this is told to us as an older Evelyn is telling her story to a young up-and-coming journalist by the name of Monique Grant, a character whose perspective we follow and who is confused as to why Evelyn would choose her to write her biography. And the connection between Monique and Evelyn remains kind of like a mystery throughout the novel for the reader and for Monique as well, until closer towards the end of the story. So now that we know what this story is about, it kind of begs the question, why don't people say what it's actually about? Now, I did hear, from time to time about Evelyn being bisexual, but it was mentioned so seldomly that I kind of assumed that it was somewhat of a subplot or something that was revealed closer to the end of the story or something like that. But it almost seems as though as if people avoided talking about Evelyn's bisexuality and her love for Celia because it was perceived as somewhat a spoiler for the story. It kind of harkens back to an age-old discourse in the book community that all started because of this book, Aristotle and Dante Discover the Secrets of the Universe by Benjamin Ray Sands. This is a story set in the 1980s about a young Mexican-American boy named Ahri who is coming to terms with his queerness and doesn't quite know how to confront it. So he doesn't explicitly say throughout the story that he's queer, but he's angry and he knows that something doesn't feel right. And he has feelings, intense feelings for his best friend Dante, but he can't quite put his finger on what his feelings are. It's not until the end of the book that he realizes that he's queer. And so a lot of people, when they were talking about this book, were trying to avoid saying that Ahri is queer because they didn't want to spoil the story, i.e. they didn't want to give away the big reveal at the end, which is the answer to why Ahri had been feeling the way that he was feeling. People were complaining when other people would mention that Ahri and Dante were queer because they would be like, oh my god, you're spoiling the book. But a lot of readers, especially queer readers, were saying, no, queerness is not a spoiler. It can't be a spoiler because what you're essentially saying is that everybody is assumed straight until proven otherwise. Sure, Ahri doesn't explicitly say that he's queer throughout the book, or at the beginning of the book especially, but he also doesn't say that he's straight. Reading these 2 books and assuming that these characters were straight until proven otherwise is heteronormativity at its best. Now, sexuality as a spoiler or being used as a plot twist in a book is a whole other conversation that we could have. But neither one of these books uses sexuality as a plot twist. The authors of these books never write sexuality to be this big surprise to the reader. It's just that these books take place in historical time periods where these characters didn't really have the language or the avenues they needed to make sense of or to come to terms with their sexualities, and were only forced to confront their sexualities when they met somebody that they cared about or that they became attracted to. Again, as I said, the issue comes from readers assuming that characters are just, straight until proven queer. And because being queer is such an anomaly to people, when a character comes to terms with their queerness later on in the story, it's seen as a plot twist or like a story reveal, like, oh my god, spoiler alert, Ahri is gay. So all this time that he was struggling about his attraction to Dante, it wasn't just a friendly thing. So when straight readers who are not really acquainted with queerness in any significant way pick up books like these, they're just not going to sit down and assume that these characters might be gay or might be queer. But queer readers could smell these things from a mile away. Queer readers are desperately looking for queer representation in the media that they consume. We read queerness into frickin' everything, even in the straightest of stories. So you might see Evelyn's bisexuality as somewhat of a spoiler to the story because it was only revealed that she was attracted to Celia maybe like 70-something, 100 pages into the book. But if you're queer, like the minute we met Celia, like her first interaction with Celia, it was very clearly obvious that Evelyn was attracted to her. She never said explicitly in the story that she was attracted to her because at the time she hadn't really come to terms with her bisexuality or she hadn't really fully understood her attraction to women. But what she was feeling was, in fact, attraction to a woman. And a queer reader could pick that up like nothing. But a straight reader might be like, oh my god, they're like so friendly, they're like besties. I also will say too, like, to be fair to everybody, that even with regards to Aristotle and Dante as well, the back summaries of the book don't also point out that these are stories about queerness, and the publishers themselves and the marketing behind the books also don't really point out that these are stories about queerness. And that could be for numerous reasons. It could be about homophobia within the publishing industry. It could also be the publishing industry being fearful that people will not buy these books if they know that it's about queerness. So maybe it's a blessing in disguise that people don't know, because maybe somebody who might be homophobic or who mightn't quite really understand queerness or empathize with it much might pick these books up thinking that it's not about queerness, but then actually see, these characters in their true full complexity, and maybe it might change their mind or something like that. And it might also just be a pleasant surprise for queer readers. Like, I've read books where it didn't say, like in the marketing of the story, or people never said that the characters were queer. When I picked up the book and I started reading it and I realized that the characters were queer, it was revealed later on that the character was queer. It was like a nice surprise, and I think people kind of enjoy that surprise, so maybe they might read the book and not want to tell you about it because they want you to pick it up and also enjoy that surprise. I think that's why I enjoyed this book as much as I did, because I picked this story up and it ended up being something that I did not expect whatsoever. I thought that this was going to be a story about like the consequences of being famous and being in the public eye, and again, it is that partially, but fame is not a huge focus of this story. Now, the media comes to play, like we do read excerpts from like newspapers and magazines and stuff about Evelyn, but those are just there to kind of like help you propel through the plot of the story. We don't really get to read much about Evelyn's personal experience with fame and being a famous person and the consequences of that. Later on in the book, maybe more than halfway through, there's a scene where she goes to like a burger joint or something, and a bunch of people are coming up to her and asking for pictures and autographs and all that kind of stuff, and she feels like, smothered and whatnot. But she'd been famous for years at this point, and while I was reading that scene, I couldn't help but think like, wait, this is the first time that we're actually seeing Evelyn deal with some of the consequences of fame, like not being able to go out and buy food in peace, right? And that's when it really dawned on me that it's because this was never really meant to be a story about fame. This was never really meant to be a story that explores Evelyn's experience with fame. It's a love story between Evelyn and Celia, and it's about how fame played a role in that. But it's not about fame. Fame was just like an agent in the story that helped to shape and create difficulties and obstacles for Evelyn and Celia. But it was never really what this story was about. And I really liked that. I liked that the story kind of subverted what readers' expectations of it would be, you know? I really enjoyed as well, like, the glamour of the story, like, you know, the ins and outs of acting and the industry and all of that. I loved learning about Evelyn's background. She came from a working class Cuban American background, and she had to basically kind of like erase her racial and ethnic identity in order to assimilate into Hollywood in the 1950s. So that was a really interesting thing to read about as well. We also get a little bit of a glimpse into Monique's personal life as well, and how her interaction with Evelyn kind of helps her make sense of the things going on in her own life. Shut up, you rude ass laptop. If it's not the freaking construction, it's my own devices working against me. And if the cliche of money can't buy you happiness could, you know, manifest itself into a book, this would be this book. Evelyn was miserable throughout this whole story. I mean, she had points of happiness in her life like everybody else, but that misery and that sadness really crept up on her throughout the story because of her struggle with fame and trying to balance having a normal relationship with Celia whilst concealing it to the rest of the world, and also having to deal with tragedy. Evelyn's life is so tragic. So many people die, and that's not really a spoiler because at the beginning of the book we're actually told like who dies and whatnot, especially given the fact that she's like 80 years old in the present day circumstance of the novel. So it's like obviously she's had to sit through a lot of deaths, right? And that was really hard to read about. It's a story about tragedy as well. It's a story about death and how that could really shape and impact a person's life, and how that compounded the struggles that Evelyn already had as a queer woman who had to spend her life hiding from the rest of the world. And I also found this story quite inspiring in some ways. It's a story about going after what you want and doing what you need to do to get what you want and stepping out of your comfort zone. I mean, Evelyn had to do that, and so did Monique, and Monique kind of learned that through listening to Evelyn. And I'm a kind of person who loves to stay in my comfort zone, and I'm not very acquainted with the act of, you know, stepping out of the comfort zone and pushing to get what I want and to get where I need to be in life. So this book kind of gave me that nudge and told me, like, you know, you need to get the fuck up and, you know, do what you need to do to secure the things that you want. So I appreciated that. I mean, I'm not gonna, like, you know, have sex with people and like show my breasts to people to get what I want, like Evelyn had to do in certain circumstances, but like, you know, I get the point. You know, I get the point of what the author was trying to put across in that sense. But what I loved the most about this story was the scope of it all. I love stories that are multiple POV. I love stories that are about like the past and how the past impacts the present and the relationship between the historical and the contemporaneous. And that's what this story is about. It reminded me a little bit of my favorite book of all time, A Tale for the Time Being, which I can't stop talking about. But it reminded me a little bit of that because it is essentially a story within a story, just like A Tale for the Time Being. And A Tale for the Time Being... Oh, let me show you my favorite book. Do y'all ever see my favorite book? Love this book. In this book, right, what happens is that we're reading the diary of a young girl, but we're also reading the story of the woman who's reading the diary. So it's a really interesting thing where you have a story within a story, and it's almost as though as if the person who is being told the story, the person who is reading the story, you're kind of like with them, the reader and the person who is being told the story within the story are both kind of sitting down in tandem with each other and learning about the other character. So in A Tale for the Time Being, when you're with the main character Ruth, you are sitting down with Ruth and reading the story of the young girl who wrote the diary. Same thing with Evelyn Hugo. You and Monique are kind of like sitting down together and listening to Evelyn talk about her life. It's almost as though as if Monique is your friend who invites you to come and sit down with her as she interviews Evelyn Hugo. That's what it felt like reading this book, and that's what I really, really enjoyed the most about this story. I love stories with scope, with multiple POVs, with different historical and, you know, time periods and settings, and this book really provided that for me. I didn't think that this would be a story that would hit on the beats that I tend to love about books, but it did in so many different ways. I definitely need to read more from Taylor Jenkins Reid. This was really the only book of hers that I was kind of interested in reading, this and maybe in another life, but now that I've read this book and I really enjoyed it, I think I definitely want to read some more of her works. Daisy Jones and the Sixth, for example, is a book when everybody was talking about it, I was like, nah. I did not have any interest whatsoever of reading that book, even though I did kind of have some interest in this and some of her other titles. Daisy Jones and the Six was just like, I don't want to read that, it doesn't sound like anything that I would like. But now that I really liked this book, I think I might give this a try. I also have to say that I got this copy free from a local independent bookstore called BookTT. They are an online bookstore that you could find through Instagram. I'll link their Instagram down below and on the screen. If you're from Trinidad, please follow them. Please support them. Please buy from them. They have a very, very wide array of books, from fiction to non-fiction. They have actually a lot of non-fiction options. So if you're the kind of person who likes business books, entrepreneurial, self-help, they have a lot of that. And they also have a lot of popular fiction as well, and books that you mightn't necessarily really find in the local chain bookstores. So definitely go try them out. They gave me this book for free in exchange for like reviewing it and tagging them, which I'll do on Instagram, but I definitely want to do here as well. Amazing service, so definitely go support them. But yeah, I think that's pretty much everything that I have to say for this video. In the comments down below, I'd love to know if you have also read The 7 Husbands of Evelyn Hugo, which I know most of you probably already have, and what your thoughts were on this book. Also, have you ever read a book that was popular that you kind of stayed away from for a while because you didn't really get a good impression of what the story was about and you didn't want to jump on the hype train, but then you eventually read the book and realized that it's freaking amazing and everybody was kind of right? Tell me, let me know in the comments down below, because maybe there are some other books that I'm kind of ignoring that I might actually really love if I give them a try. So thank you all so much for watching this video. I hope you have a lovely, lovely day, and until next time, inshallah, keep reading.